Now, on January 6th, Democrats are trying to seize the narrative and seize the day. But know this, the game you are watching is not the game being played. This was far less an insurrection and likely far more a Fedsurrection, and the most in-depth reporting, the best investigative news you could possibly get on this subject, you're going to find at revolver.news. And I am here to announce that today I took the body of reporting from Revolver News, from Stuart Rhodes to Ray Epps to even those acting likely in concert with Ray Epps, and I inserted those into the official congressional record. So we're going to get the truth out there. No better person to chat with than Dr. Darren Beattie, the austere publisher of Revolver News. Thanks for joining me, Darren.
It's a delight to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Darren, we're going to talk about the 6th and how that day unfolded. But you revealed in your most recent reporting on Revolver News something that happened on January 5th that I don't think a lot of Americans really know about. But it was this monumental event that unfolded literally almost on the steps of the Department of Justice. Explain to the audience.
Yes, and there are several things on the 5th, but I believe you're referring to the so-called Trump hippie van,
Yes.
colloquially referred to by researchers as the Trump hippie van. And this was a van with Stop the Steal insignia and at least presenting as people who would have an intention to go to the Trump rally the next day. Well, on the 5th, this so-called Trump hippie van was stopped right outside of the Department of Justice. And the federal law enforcement authorities discovered there were explosives in this van and firearms.
What did you find in there? Do you know?
Sir, I can't comment.
Is there anyone who's authorized to comment?
Nope.
And they made a big deal out of it, as you would expect. They, processed everyone in the van. They wanted to take DNA swabs, the whole works. And what's remarkable, well, there's a couple things that's remarkable about this. One is that I would imagine most of your listeners, who are generally very educated on these matters, have not even heard about this. And what's strange about that is that the media would have seemed to have every incentive in amplifying coverage of a story of, oh, look, another van of Trump supporters with explosives right outside the Department of Justice. This is a huge deal. This is the next 9/11. Like, they would have far more justification blowing that up than the treatment that they've given to the subsequent event of 1/6. And so why is this thing buried in local media coverage and something that nobody's talking about, nobody's covering? That's an interesting story in its own right, and we can speculate on that basis and say, if there was a threat of this magnitude right outside of the Department of Justice, it makes it yet more difficult to account for the fact that January 6th, the Capitol building and the surrounding environment enjoyed uniquely poor security. It wasn't just that they didn't have enhanced security, which would have been entirely called for and justified and even expected given something like this, and simply given that there would be a big politically charged rally nearby, but that it didn't even enjoy normal security on that day is something that is quite astonishing. But
and Darren, now I've been to dozens of Trump rallies all over this country, and I have never seen a group called Hippies for Trump. But yet all of a sudden on January 5th, they show up in this bus, and we start to learn about one of the individuals who's on this bus. We later kind of learn about him as Black Ski Mask Guy in your reporting, but there's actually a little interview he does right there on the 5th. Let's play that clip.
And then they try to get us to take DNA swabs.
DNA swabs?
Yeah.
See if our DNA matched the weapons that were found on the vehicle.
How many weapons?
I don't know.
How many weapons did they find?
I think one or two. They were pretty quick at getting.
They were also hinting that there was a bomb on the bus.
You're absolutely right. So the significance of this story goes far beyond the fact that there was this major terror scare effectively on the 5th, right outside the Department of Justice. And even that couldn't justify normal levels of security on the next day when a major politically charged rally would occur within close proximity to the Capitol and other relevant buildings.
And then this very person who's on the Hippies for Trump bus, who gives this interview, who is subjected to federal law enforcement questioning, then all of a sudden appears on the 6th.
I'm taking that today.
They weren't detained, they weren't held. Yet again, Black Ski Mask Guy appears on the 6th. What are we to think about the fact that this individual on the 6th seems to be animating violence, on the 5th has an encounter with law enforcement, and seemingly has faced no charge?
Well, you're absolutely right to point this out. And so in the latest Bombshell Revolver.News investigative report, we cover a handful of characters who were at the Peace Monument, near the Peace Monument at the very beginning, right, well before Trump finished his speech, by the way. They were all hanging out in the same spot early in the day, and they all went on to play decisive roles in creating the conditions for the Trump rally to turn into a riot at the Capitol. And they did that by removing barriers, cutting down fencing, effectively creating a booby trap so that the people coming over to the Capitol from the rally had no idea that they were technically trespassing on Capitol grounds because the barriers had been removed. And then, of course, you had various provocateurs ginning them up, and we cover those people too. And this individual Black Ski Mask Guy who was in the Hippies for Trump van is one of those key individuals who just showed up very early on and was methodically, in a seemingly cool, detached, professional way, removing barriers and helping to create the conditions for this rally to become a riot. And what's amazing about this individual is that we know that the feds know who he is because he was stopped in the van the previous day. There's not even this plausible deniability excuse of, oh, they haven't found out who he is. We know that they know who he is because he was stopped in the van literally the day before. And what are the chances that this guy who was stopped in this bizarre Hippies for Trump van with explosives and firearms right outside of the Department of Justice and let free then just happens to be one of the key individuals removing fencing to allow for the riot to occur on January 6th? We know that they know who he is, and he's unindicted.
So there's an important element. There's an important element here of pattern recognition, Darren, where sometimes when there is a federal asset or a federal agent or someone who's acting in response to a federal handler, that there may be other people that are subjected to that type of control from the FBI or other federal law enforcement, and they don't necessarily know what each other are doing. Now, we learned about this from your reporting from the sort of the phony Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, kidnapping plot that I think a lot of reporting has shown was animated by elements within the federal government. But just talk about that dynamic where you can actually have multiple people acting in response to stimuli from federal law enforcement, and they might not even know that another person, part of the plot, is doing the very same thing.
Absolutely. And, when you look at the history of these types of operations, federal infiltration operations, you note that the feds, very much like cockroaches, there's never just one. There are multiple. And you see that in the incredible Fed infiltration ratio of the Michigan plot, which, as I've talked about on your program and elsewhere, has a remarkable Fed infiltration percentage. 12 out of the 26 so-called plotters turned out to have been informants or federal agents proper. And this was essentially a dry run for 1/6, in as much as it was the same plot. It involved storming the Michigan state capitol. It involved one of the three main militia groups imputed to 1/6, namely the Three Percenters. And just as the cherry on top, the head of the Detroit field office who oversaw this Michigan Fed infiltration operation was later promoted to D.C., where he went on to oversee the January 6th investigations.
Well, it is a false flag operation, in essence.
Right, precisely.
The Hippies for Trump van was a false flag. Ray Epps was a false flag. In a lot of ways, Stuart Rhodes and his involvement raises many of these serious questions.
Precisely.
And what's brilliant in the Revolver piece is you actually have some of the time-stamped video that shows how these people were all doing very distinct things. And, in your prior coverage of Ray Epps, you raised the question, well, how did this person come all the way from Arizona to Washington, D.C., presumably to hear Donald Trump speak, but as Trump is speaking, you've actually got video of Ray Epps at the breach site. Let's play that video and get your reaction.
So can we come up?
Hey, go to that house. Go to that house.
Yeah, whose side are you on? Constitution or the government? Because they're not the same thing.
Hey, paycheck, yeah?
I'm not picking on them, but you know what? You know what?
I can't.
Noted.
All right, noted. Okay, but one more thing.
Yeah, so can we go up there? No?
When we go in,
are we going to get arrested if we
leave
go
this
up there?
here. You don't need to get
Did you
shot.
arrest us all?
And so now, Darren, react to just sort of the methodical nature of Ray Epps being there at the breach site and the significance of that geography.
Right. Yes. So this is the initial breach site. This is the fateful and first breach event. It occurred on 12:53 p.m., so well before Trump had finished his speech, which is important to note because the people who were there breaking down these barriers, cutting down the fencing, they weren't at the Trump speech because Trump was speaking as this was going on. They were creating the conditions such that when the Trump people went to the Capitol, that would be the area that they passed by, and there would be no visible barriers or fencing, and they would go on restricted grounds that day. Usually those grounds are not restricted. On that day, they would be restricted, and they'd be met with various provocateurs who would take it from there. And the significance of Epps being right at that breach site, literally 2 seconds before the breach, he whispers in someone's ear who goes and breaks down the metal barricades. This needs to be understood in the context of Epps' activities for the previous 24 hours, because the most famous video of Epps is on January 5th in the evening, going to all types of different groups, stating explicitly, we need to go into the Capitol tomorrow. We need to go into the Capitol.
I'm going to put it out there. I'm probably going to go to jail for it, okay? Tomorrow, we need to go into the Capitol. Into the Capitol. Peacefully.
Fed.
The mountains of video documentary evidence on January 5th and 6th, this is the only guy we have on tape, dead to rights, explicitly calling for this bizarre mission to go into the Capitol. And people treat it as bizarre. They said, what are you talking about? Going into the Capitol? You must be a Fed. What's going on? But it turns out he wasn't just some random drunk guy who had a crazy idea and we never heard from him. He followed up on his stated mission on January 6th, a Where's Waldo figure everywhere around the Capitol, reminding people, go into the Capitol. After the rally, go to the Capitol. That's where our problems are.
As soon as President Trump is finished speaking, we are going to the Capitol. It's that direction. That's where our true problems lie. President Trump is done speaking. We are going to the Capitol. That's where our problems are. Okay, folks, we need your help. As soon as President Trump stops speaking, we are going to the Capitol. The Capitol's in that direction. Let people know. Spread the word.
And sure enough, right at the initial breach site, that fateful first breach event at 12:53 p.m., he's right there and whispers into someone's ear, and 2 seconds later, we have the very first and decisive breach. So, and this guy, Ray Epps, he was originally, as I said, on the FBI's 20 most wanted list for January 6th. They claimed to be so interested in him when the internet identified who he was, and the day after Revolver.News ran a report on his fellow Oath Keeper Stuart Rhodes, the FBI scrubbed his name and his face from their public database, and since then their only pronouncements regarding Ray Epps is to pretend like they don't know who he is.
And this is the most sweeping investigation ever, right? We've heard from senior officials at the Department of Justice and the FBI that they'll turn over every stone. They were ransacking the home of some boomers in Homer, Alaska but somehow Ray Epps, who methodically is trying to get people into the Capitol, doesn't seem to face those same tough questions. But could Ray Epps's mission been accomplished alone? I think your reporting suggests that it could not have. It required people like Black Ski Mask Guy, and I want you to take a moment and talk about Fence Cutter, because as you've got Trump not even done with his speech yet, you have someone who seems almost emotionally detached from the circumstances around them, removing the fencing so that future people who would arrive at the Capitol would be unsuspecting of that having been a barrier. What do we know about the Fence Cutter, Darren?
Exactly. And look, so, I mean, people have different degrees of investment in this story, different degrees of knowledge in this story. I think one really powerful thing about this latest Revolver.News report is, to a large degree, the video evidence speaks for itself. Like, nobody can watch those videos and come to a common sense objective conclusion that there isn't something severely off here. But of course, we need to put together the evidence into a story, a narrative of what was actually taking place. And as you suggest, there's no way Ray Epps was acting alone. That's just not how the feds do things. There are multiple people in place, and one tell that applies to Epps and these other people is the contrast, the profound contrast between the radical nature of what they're doing, demanding people go into the Capitol, cutting down fencing and so forth, and the emotional detachment, the cool, methodical, professional manner in which they conduct themselves. It would be one thing for people to get caught up in the crowd psychology and just go angry and crazy and just flail about and do something wild. It's another to see that cool, detached, professional, methodical manner of operating. You see that in Epps, and you see that in this other guy who, again, he's not at the Trump rally. He's there at the Capitol cutting down fences methodically and removing the fences such that when the Trump crowd gets there at the direction of Ray Epps and others like him, they're not going to see any barriers, and they're going to have no idea that they're technically committing a criminal offense. And then you have this other individual that I think is a Ray Epps-sized scandal in its own right, Scaffold Commander, who's there with his bullhorn repeatedly and constantly saying, move forward, please help, move forward.
Move forward, climb up over the wall, get into those bleachers. Don't just stand there, move forward. Move forward. Help somebody over the wall. Help somebody over the wall, move forward.
Now, when we look at the organizations that make this destruction and the people who run them, it becomes rather apparent.
Just as the basic of crowd psychology, you get there with a crowd, you hear a repeated, continuous, authoritative voice from a bullhorn saying, move forward, you move forward. You don't know if something happened in the crowd and they need you to clear up space, you obey. And so all of these pieces are in place to engineer this scenario where there would be a riot, where people would be at the Capitol grounds and there would be ultimate breach of the Capitol. And when the Capitol building itself was breached, the same guy with the bullhorn is saying, we need to fill up the Capitol. Fill it up right now. Come on. We need more people. Please help fill up the Capitol.
Okay, we're in. We're in. Come on. We got to fill up the Capitol. Come on. Come now. Come now. We need help. We're going to fill up the Capitol. They got in. Come on.
He's up on the top of the scaffold with his bullhorn. Yet another person who showed up right at the Peace Monument early on before anyone else, along with these other figures, and yet another person who's unindicted completely.
And Scaffold Commander doesn't seem to just have a tactical role here. He seems to have a leadership role, commanding this group of people. So you can start to see how sort of the different instruments of the Fedsurrection start to come together as one orchestra.
Exactly.
The night before, you've got Ray Epps with this professional focus on entering the Capitol. You've got Black Ski Mask Guy saying, we have to take that ground, we have to go inside. Then you've got the fence coming down, and then you've got this loud voice from the Scaffold Commander. I don't even know how he gets up there, how he gets a bullhorn that seems to look a lot like the bullhorns that are elsewhere in the crowd. What do we know, Darren, about the federal government's pursuit of Scaffold Commander for quite literally animating and accelerating the criminal activity?
Well, as far as I know, there's been no pursuit whatsoever. There's been no arrest. There's been nothing, which is remarkable because, again, it's not just that he happens to be a guy on the scaffold calling for people to move forward and go into the Capitol. He fits that precise pattern of the key individuals who are just hanging out, loitering right by the Peace Monument, right nearby the site where that initial breach occurred at 12:53. He's hanging out there, provoking law enforcement very early on in the day.
You gotta stop us! We're coming! I see you pacing around. Are you thinking about it? We're coming! We see you pacing. Are you thinking about it?
And he, like the others who are hanging out at the same place at the same time, early before everyone, before the Proud Boys contingent even arrived at the initial breach site, and it's the official story that the Proud Boys kicked everything off. And yet, you have this collection of individuals hanging out at this very spot before the Proud Boys even got there, who all went on to play decisive roles in engineering the riot of January 6th. And all of these people, unlike many of the Proud Boys, are unindicted and even unsearched.
So what's the motive, Darren? I mean, if the federal government didn't just have one person, but had almost a cadre of people doing very specific things to ensnare a bunch of people who thought they were part of a rally or a march or a peaceful protest in this investigation, it seems like a lot of effort and resource was put into it. To what end?
Well, that's a great question. And before I get to that, I'd just like to very briefly state that not only is it overwhelmingly likely that there are multiple feds, that Ray Epps was not acting alone, that there are multiple feds, but I would suspect it's overwhelmingly likely that multiple different federal agencies had people in place, and there very likely wasn't a centralized coordination and communication between those various agencies. So I would not be shocked at all if, when all is said and done, it turns out that the FBI had people there, the JTTF had people there, Army Counterintelligence had people there, DHS had people there, and they may not have necessarily known what the other people are doing. In fact, just 2 days ago, Newsweek came out with a report that the DOJ, the acting attorney general, unilaterally authorized this highly classified, top secret shoot-to-kill commando force to go to the Capitol on January 6th on the basis of some bizarre intelligence that they received regarding weapons of mass destruction. I'm not even kidding. This Newsweek came out with this piece a couple days ago, and they didn't communicate this to the Capitol Police or other law enforcement agencies. And that's reporting from Newsweek, and we know that fairly well now. So there's a lot of different actors involved from a lot of different government agencies, I would say. What's the purpose? Well, the purpose is political. We have to understand the broader context here. The broader context is to feed into the agenda whereby anyone who is a Trump supporter or adjacent to Trump support, or even in the most remote sense of being an objector to the agenda and direction of our corrupt regime, anyone who fits into that category, doesn't completely comply and fall into line, is by extension, by implication, a domestic terrorist. And therefore the government can justify its movement to marshal the full weight and influence and force of the national security apparatus domestically in order to crush this alleged national security threat of people who hold political opinions that are inconvenient for the people who control our country.
It would be one of the greatest scandals in our nation's history, and it is unfolding before our very eyes. Part of the Republican response to all of this concerns me, Darren. Republican leadership tells our members, we should spend January 6th talking about Pelosi's failures in not marshaling sufficient defenses, and why weren't there more National Guard on call, and why didn't we protect the Capitol more? And what I worry about that is it seems to justify that enhanced utilization of the national security infrastructure against our people. And far more productive to actually get to the truth would be to issue the subpoenas to people like Ray Epps, to identify people like Scaffold Commander, to get to the bottom of any records created on January 5th for the hippies for Trump bus. Do you worry that an overemphasis on, well, Pelosi just wasn't defensive and prepared enough might really miss the point and distract us from the pursuit of the truth that is so necessary in this scandal?
That's an excellent point. I'm really, really happy that you raised that point. And it really underscores a general proposition that the narrative matters so much. Before Revolver.News' reporting, the narrative on 1/6 from the right was fit into two categories. One category was, oh, these are leftists, these are Antifa infiltrators. And the second category is, oh, the people are largely harmless. Now, there could be truth to both of those narratives. I'm not discounting those entirely. But it was only when Revolver shifted the narrative to, wait a minute, this looks like the government doing exactly what it's been doing for decades now. And it fits all the patterns, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence that this is the best explanation. It's not Antifa. It's not the left. It's not Nancy Pelosi. This is the national security apparatus doing what it's done to the American people for decades. That is an extremely subversive narrative. It happens to be true, but it's so extremely subversive because it can't simply be dismissed away or dissipated or neutralized in the bread and circuses performative nonsense of typical, partisan politics narratives. And that's why I think like the Nancy Pelosi stuff, I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi. She may have had some idea of what was going on and just tacitly knew to keep out of it and to not call for more security. But to make her a primary figure of all of this, given the political avatar that she is, like, we might as well blame it all on AOC and her dress, because it's equally ridiculous, it's equally weak, it's equally a part of this universe of bread and circuses nonsense political discourse. And if we do that, the actual perpetrators, the actual evil forces that the influence on our country and on the American people will laugh all the way to the next plot against the American people unopposed. And so that's why Revolver.News, myself, you, everyone who's been brave and discerning enough to focus persistently on this one narrative that they don't want you to touch, the FBI involvement, the government involvement narrative. That's why we've got so much incoming, because the powers that be would love for nobody to talk about it at all. The second best is for it to be caught up in the typical bread and circuses of dumb political discourse, partisan discourse. What they don't want is for us to talk about it the way we're talking about it now. And that's why they've been so freaked out and pushed back so hard and tried to silence us so vigorously.
And it is uncomfortable. And frankly, Darren, I think that if we talk to 1,000 regular Americans out in the country, there probably wouldn't be too many of them that think about January 6th one way or the other as a principal element of their daily life or something that informs on their quality of life to a great degree. And so there is this real binary question that will present to Republicans if we take power after the next election. What to do with the January 6th committee? And there was certainly a time where I thought, just disband the darn thing. Let's get to solving people's actual problems. Let's get to making their lives better. But after the most recent report from Revolver.News, I don't think we can disband the January 6th committee. I think we have to take over the January 6th committee, issue subpoenas, bring Ray Epps forward, use the best technology to identify these people like Scaffold Commander, like Fence Cutter, like Black Ski Mask Guy, and put the truth, however uncomfortable it may be, before the entire country. Do you think that Republicans need to make that commitment regarding January 6th to our voters and really just to the essence of the truth?
Absolutely. I think there needs to be a real committee investigating this and using real authority to get to the bottom of this. We need to be able to take control of the committee in order for that to happen. Until that happens, the committee is just a political clown show, an element of political theater that exists to obfuscate the truth about 1/6 and to aggressively promote the very dangerous political narrative that was the purpose of the 1/6 setup in the first place, which is to demonize half the American people as de facto domestic terrorists. Through the valiant efforts of yourself and other brave members of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, and others, I think we can have some real progress on that side. But until there's full control over the committee, my sense now is that a productive avenue to get to the bottom of things is actually through the various defense counsels for January 6 defendants, who can use their capacity as defense counsels to demand potentially exculpatory evidence, to demand evidence that could point to entrapment. That's what the defense counsel is doing in the Michigan case. And I'm pleased to report that a defense counsel for Kelly Meggs, who is an oath keeper who's been charged, has put forth a petition to subpoena both Ray Epps and Stuart Rhodes. And so I think we can start to see progress as well from the defense counsel, who's also starting to take up this idea of, what really happened here was much darker than we ever expected, and they do have some power and authority in their legal capacity to get to the bottom of this as well.
We will be following that litigation closely, and I think we have to make a commitment to expose these uncomfortable truths wherever they may bring us. You know what I've learned? If you give it enough time, 3 things that always show themselves: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Thank you for exposing the truth on Revolver.News. I am proud to take the body of your reporting work, place it into the congressional record today, so that this day does not conclude without the key questions being presented, and hopefully we'll have the capability to answer them soon. Thanks so much, Darren Beattie, publisher of Revolver News, for joining us. We'll be following your reporting closely.
Thank you so much.